Hello and welcome to my podcast called Innervation. Innervation was inspired by my previous podcast, Silence, where over the course of 2 years, I spoke weekly with a total of 100 women from science, technology, engineering and mathematics, or STEM. I kept all of those guests anonymous back then so that they could talk openly and honestly about their lives. We discussed their experiences, what they've learned along their life journeys, and their hopes and ideas for living fulfilling and contented lives. Because their identities were kept safe, the conversations on Silence were always so raw and transparent, and we didn't just talk about being women in STEM, but about everything. The topics that tended to come up are also the same topics that I discuss with my own friends and family, or I'm asked about in private when I've given a talk in schools and colleges. So it seemed clear to me that there are just some topics that we have in our lives and are on our minds that are really important to us, but we only really discuss them with people that we're very close to. And so I thought, rather than keep those topics and themes amongst a small group, how about throwing them out there into the world through this podcast? So what I've done is sift through all the episodes of Silence to bring you my favourite sound bites on these certain topics. Each week on Innervation, I'll be reflecting on the perspectives that came up from Silence that are actually pearls of wisdom that I found particularly provoking, inspiring and empowering, in the hope that they resonate with you too. This week is all about permission. So what do I mean by permission? Well, I must say this is something that has been very much on my mind this week, because I have been in a couple of situations recently where I'm surrounded by a bunch of amazing women, and when they're really open and honest about their lives, and maybe they're crying or they're finding it really hard to admit their truth, and they acknowledge that and they say, I'm really embarrassed to say this, but blah, 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 or this is going to sound really awful, but I'm going to say it anyway. Like, basically, that kind of truth and honesty gives you permission to be yourself. And I find that that's probably the most powerful thing about connecting with other people is when you resonate with other people's stories and people say things that you can really relate to, it gives you permission to be who you are. That's certainly been my experience, and I think that's why I'm so keen on encouraging diversity and inclusion, because when you are in a group and you feel like you're the only one, you don't really feel like you've got permission to be yourself. Whereas when you're in a group and you can relate to, a couple of people in that group, it gives you permission to be yourself. And I've been thinking a lot about permission because as a woman of colour in engineering, yes, I was massively the odd one out kind of thing. And so I always felt like I didn't really have permission to be a woman in engineering. I didn't have permission to be of ethnic minority amongst a very homogenous group of people. And because I didn't feel like I deserved to be there or that I should be there, I always held back from giving myself permission to speak up for myself or be heard or be seen or be pretty or be smart or be any of these things, because I just couldn't see anyone like me around. And so giving yourself permission is actually a really, really massive, major, big deal. And so I wanted to sort of take this podcast opportunity to kind of break down what giving permission might look like. Giving yourself permission. What form does that take? What does that even mean? And so I'm going to start with a quote from episode 34, because I feel like permission and validation can very much be interlinked, but maybe by the time we get to the end of this podcast, there might be a more clear distinction between the two. But this quote from episode 34 is very much about validation. So let's listen to it.
In the past, like the reason I love math is because I've gotten like so much validation from teachers like in the past, like, oh, like you should keep this up, like you should continue like doing math, like you're really good at it. And so like the validation from others also is like a big part of, I think, being confident in yourself in these fields.
Yeah.
I think validation is really important. I think it's really important to get recognition for who we are. And I've done an episode on recognition, and, you know, I think sometimes the need for validation and recognition can get out of hand, and it can become a driver, an ambition, you know, to get as many followers, to get a bigger audience, to be admired, for people to somehow be impressed. And I think it's really important to have that. I mean, nobody wants to be on this planet and be completely transparent, you know, invisible. I think it is important to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. But we are living in a society where sometimes that need for validation can really get out of hand. But with my guest from episode 34, she clearly needed validation in order to feel encouraged to keep going in something like math. And so, you know, I think that's healthy. I think it's really good. If you're good at something and people recognize that, that can be really encouraging. I have always been a person that is encouraged by my own success. Now, the downside of that is when I'm not successful, I'm really, really demotivated. And I think there is a happy medium ground somewhere in between. But yeah, I think validation is important. It's important to recognize when you're good at something. It's important for other people to see when you're good at something. But we always have to keep ourselves in check that we're not taking it too far. And that's what my guest from episode 57 does. I think she, within herself, realised that she was reaching a very dangerous line when it comes to validation and recognition, and that she had to sort of take stock and put herself back on safe tracks. So this from episode 57.
That I needed a new story about that because I just felt unsuccessful in my life generally because I was living in a small country town. Even though my businesses were successful, I was making a difference, I was living a beautiful life, I still didn't feel successful because the story that I was telling was, oh, I don't live in Sydney, ergo I'm not successful. So I just started to change that. I'm like, I am incredibly successful and I can feel successful living in a small country town. I have permission for that. And it really started to change things.
I think once we start recognising our qualities and our skills and our talents, and we start giving ourselves a bit of self-love, I think that gives us permission to exist in the world. I think the danger of seeking validation and recognition from people, places and things outside of ourselves often means that we are held back because we're waiting for what other people think of us to give us permission to be. You know, if you're wanting to dye your hair a bright electric pink, and you know you test the water by dyeing your hair a softer, kind of more less impactful pink to see what people think, and then based on their opinions you then go stronger and stronger to a more electric version of pink. It means that you're kind of waiting for permission outside of yourself in order to do something that you wanted to do from the start, which is to just have electric pink hair. And I think rather than waiting for people to validate us and recognize us for what we want to do, it's really empowering to give yourself permission. And it's not easy to do. I think it's really, really difficult to give yourself permission to do things, because I think we're all none of us have got this thing called life figured out. I think a lot of people who really figure it out end up being a lot older because they've lived life and they've worked out a few lessons and they've gathered up a whole load of wisdom with time. And, you know, by then we've just wasted so many opportunities to give ourselves permission for the things that, you know, are probably troubling us in our youth. One example of that for me is that I was never ever giving myself permission to feel confident and comfortable in my own skin. And for a long time, I often looked in the mirror and thought, well, I could be skinnier, I could be taller, I could be this, I could be that. And I was never giving myself permission to just be confident. You know, there was always a reason why not to be confident. And I think giving yourself permission to say, yes, okay, you're not as tall as everybody else, but you can still stand tall in your own skin, you know, that would have been an extremely empowering mindset and perspective. But I just didn't have that wisdom back then. And so being able to give yourself permission as soon as possible, I think is a real skill. Like, we are taught to seek permission from the outside world. It's just ingrained in us. But I think, you know, with self-awareness, you can give yourself permission to be who you are much, much earlier on in life. And my guest from episode 84 sums that up.
I have to keep reminding myself again, like what we were talking about with failure earlier, to take it easy, that I'm not going to be able to be perfect at all the things in one go. Like, at the moment, I am not operating at maximal capacity. And I know exactly where my maximum capacity is from doing a PhD, because at the end, you have to work so close to your maximum that you learn exactly where that threshold is. And now I'm like, oh my God, I'm only working at 60%. I'm not working hard enough. I'm not making the most of the opportunities and all of that. And I'm like, wait a second, like, that other 40% of my capacity is going towards getting used to everything being new and
adapting to change,
coping with all of this change in my life. That takes up a huge amount of brain space. And so of course I'm going to have less brain space left to do the other things that I would want to do. And so it's just giving myself that permission and that self-compassion to not be doing all the things straight away. And I still keep catching myself being like, oh, I could be doing more. I think it's that perfectionism thing. I could be doing more, but if I did try and push through it, I would break. And so I won't do that. I'll give myself a chance.
That's probably why permission was rattling around in my head this week, because, you know, if it is tied in with perfectionism, inability to allow yourself to fail, needing validation from the outside world, you know, it can be really hard to develop permission to just be yourself. And so permission is kind of, it's just such a powerful concept. And now I find that I really gravitate towards individuals who give themselves permission to be themselves. Like, it's you can spot it a mile off when people are just massively confident, and I mean like profoundly confident, not superficial arrogance and kind of pretend confidence, but people who really really know themselves well. And that's the kind of sentiment I get from my guest from episode 21, who really is just very comfortable with who she is. And as a result, she gives herself permission to be, and it has a knock-on effect with anybody else that's around her.
And to be that person and to say, yeah, I am an engineer, but I'm also emotional, and the two are not mutually exclusive, right?
But it's also accepting yourself for who you are, which is the most powerful thing you can do.
And men have emotions too. And one of the things that one of the guys told me, and this is in a Nordic country where they're a little more stoic, but what he told me was so powerful. He told me that one day I got really emotional about something was not working. You know, I get like this sometimes when the project, you know, things are not working. And then I said, I'm sorry, I'm getting very emotional. And he said, no, you being emotional gives us permission to be emotional too, so it's okay.
Yeah.
And I felt so good that with these guys, some of them, bring them with us. We can lead them. Don't just think that I want to be their equal. Think of there's something I can give to these guys and lead them into a better place of comfortable. We are okay with the complexities of life and emotions, and let's bring that into the workplace too, and kind
Yeah.
of help them, talk to them about this and, see.
Gosh, I mean, what she talks about is just so powerful because, this idea that maybe men are looking for permission as well to be themselves. I mean, men are often really expected to, not have emotions and be the tough guy and lead the way. And I think when women can be a bit sort of like more honest about what they're feeling without feeling bad. I think what I'm trying to say is that there has to be an education of both men and women to just be themselves. Because I think when people are not themselves, they're preventing other people from being themselves. When you have a facade up, you kind of make people pressured to put a facade up as well. And there's just so much fakeness and so much sort of denial of who we are, And as a result, like, no one gives permission to be themselves. And we just end up living in this like Facebook superficial world where everyone's presenting their best selves and not really allowing themselves to be human. And I just find it very interesting that maybe men have this even worse than women. Because at least with women, they do tend to get together and chat and, let their hair down and things like that. Whereas I'm not sure guys really get the chance to do that or feel comfortable doing that. I mean, I wouldn't have a clue, to be honest, but I'm just assuming that guys, amongst guys, put a lot of pressure on each other to man up. And, this is where women can actually show their leadership skills and qualities by saying, you know what, I'm going to be emotional and I'm not going to ask you for permission to be emotional. One of the things that I really get worried about when I hear women talk about their experiences is that they always are having to ask permission. Like, they expect to get permission from others. It's that classic daddy issue type thing where we put men on a pedestal and are constantly needing to ask permission from men to feel beautiful, to feel lovable, to feel like they can lead or be smart or, all these kinds of things. Where women are often asking for permission from men. And that just simply has to stop. I think by loving ourselves, by having self-compassion, self-respect and self-belief, we can give ourselves permission to be exactly who we are. And who knows, the tables might turn and men might actually feel permission to be who they are too. I love this idea of people learning from each other. I do get quite cringy actually when I talk about men and women and the differences because there's such a mixture of people out there these days. But I think, masculine and feminine traits have been categorized. And I've certainly witnessed a real sort of, in this patriarchal system, like this need to always be asking permission. And the idea that women could lead is such a great one by this guest from episode 21. And so I fully support it. And I think, again, it ties back to this idea of self-love because, without self-love and self-belief, it is really difficult to give yourself permission. And my guest from episode 23 sums it up very succinctly.
And it's about permission too, giving yourself permission just to stand up and have an opinion that's not going to be popular.
Yeah, I think the reality is that when you give yourself permission, you do have to expect that not everyone's going to agree with you, but you're giving yourself the authority over yourself. Yeah, that's what I love about this concept about permission. You're not doing something and then kind of recoiling because not everyone liked it. You're giving yourself permission because you're saying, no, I'm in charge of my own life and I'm going to make a decision. And if some people don't like it, that's tough. You know, that's just so incredibly empowered, you know, and it's about shining bright as an individual and not apologizing or feeling bad that you've got a bright light to shine and that people need to give you permission to shine. And that's exactly what my guest from episode 56 talks about.
Yeah, exactly. And whenever you step up and shine your light, it gives someone else permission to step up and shine their light too. And I think it's so important for women to get over that idea of, you know, it's not bragging to talk about your accomplishments and your achievements. You're actually inspiring other people by sharing your story and talking about the work that you're doing.
I think it's so important to give yourself permission, but I also think it's a very complex mental attitude to get to, because I think we are programmed in society to always ask for permission. I mean, we have laws, we have rules, we have teachers, we have elders. We are always having to seek permission from others. And whilst I do really agree with a lot of that, you know, I come from a culture where respecting your elders is so important and so traditional. And I actually love that tradition of being able to respect your elders. But I also do think that we all get to a point in our lives where we are fully fledged adults and we shouldn't have to keep asking permission from everyone. And, you know, I do think that's the difference between being a child and being an adult, is that you're giving yourself permission. You are in control of your own life, and the best parents in the world are parents that really train their kids from young to start making decisions for themselves. I feel sorry for parents that run around after their children, never really giving the children an opportunity to learn how to live life for themselves. And so I guess what I'm saying is learning how to give yourself permission is a true mark of empowerment in my book. You know, I really do feel that giving yourself permission is certainly a destination I want to get to, and it might take me a while to fully embrace this idea, but, you know, the cogs have started turning in my own mind on this subject of giving permission to myself to be who I am. And yeah, it's a journey. It's a process of innervation, which is exactly why it's a theme for this show. So my last quote is from episode 18, and I'm going to leave you with it. It's this idea that we can really sort of know ourselves. We can really, you know, we can seek validation and recognition from the outside world, but I think it's also really important to know deeply who you are and give yourself permission to just simply be. This from episode 18.
Yeah, you absolutely cannot be waiting for somebody else to tell you that you have validation. I hope that most women can get to a place of just inherently believing that they have value because they exist. Me being a person in love of math, I need a way of measuring that, so it always has to do with what I can do and like what I have done for the world, but at least that's something entirely within my control. Like, it's somebody else.
It's a process. It's definitely not easy. But I think as each day goes by, it's an opportunity to really grow and learn and understand who we are as individuals. And it very much is an inner journey, but one that's definitely worth taking. Thank you so much for listening. Please do subscribe to this podcast and maybe even rate and review it if you can. I'd love to have your feedback about this episode or any others that you've listened to, and maybe some suggestions for future topics for this show. It's all about self-discovery and evolution on Innervation, so be kind and loving to yourselves, and I wish you all a great week.